Before we get started, make sure to subscribe to the channel and like this video. That way, you'll always stay connected to our stories and never miss the next adventure. Commander Felnoir stared at the security feed, his claws frozen halfway to the emergency lockdown button, as the human daycare worker reached down and plucked a crystalline cube directly from between the jaws of a Calthoran cub. The cub should have torn her arm off. Every biological imperative, every instinct bred into the most feared predatory species in known space should have triggered the moment her fingers touched that toy. The control room held 8 species worth of diplomatic personnel, and not one of them was breathing. On screen, the human, Tina, according to her file, held the cube up and examined it with mild interest, while the cub, all 60 pounds of dense muscle and retractable claws designed to shred hull plating, simply sat down. "Get her out of there," Ambassador Qualin whispered, her translator barely processing the words through her constricted throat. "Please, in the name of the Founders, get her out before—" Tina tossed the cube across the room. The cub's head whipped around, tracking the arc with eyes that had evolved to spot movement across asteroid fields. Then, in a movement that made Felnoir's secondary heart skip entirely, it bounded after the toy with what could only be described as enthusiasm. Playful enthusiasm. The kind of movement Calthoran cubs simply did not make unless they were practicing killing techniques on wounded prey. "That's impossible," Drelthan said flatly. The child development specialist had been standing behind Felnoir for the past 8 minutes, ever since the station's AI had flagged the situation as a potential Category 9 incident. "That behavioral pattern doesn't exist in our species. It can't. The neural pathways aren't—" The cub picked up the cube in its jaws and trotted back to Tina. It dropped the toy at her feet, then sat again, looking up at her with an expression that Felnoir's 30 rotations of military experience could not categorize within any known Calthoran behavioral matrix. Tina bent down, picked up the cube, and threw it again. The cub chased it. "How long has this been going on?" Felnoir asked, his voice hoarse. 19 minutes, the AI responded. The human entered the containment area at 0900 station time. She has made physical contact with all 8 cubs. 0 injuries sustained by either party. Current probability of human survival according to all available Calthoran behavioral models, 0.003%. "Then your models are wrong," Colin said, but her voice held no conviction. She was watching a second cub approach Tina, this one larger than the first, with the distinctive ridge patterns that marked it as the alpha of the group. The diplomatic logs had noted this particular cub as extremely aggressive and unsuitable for standard socialization protocols. It had killed its handler on the homeworld within 3 days of assignment. The cub growled, low and threatening, and moved toward the first cub's position near Tina. Every alarm in Felnoir's body activated. This was it, the moment when instinct would override whatever impossible circumstance had kept the human alive thus far. Calthoran cubs established hierarchy through violence. It was biological fact. The alpha would assert dominance, the other cub would resist, and Tina would be caught between apex predators designed by evolution to kill without hesitation. Tina straightened up, turned to face the alpha cub, and pointed toward the corner of the room. "Time out," she said calmly. "We don't growl at our friends when they're playing." The alpha cub stopped moving. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, with movements that suggested profound confusion, it turned and walked to the corner Tina had indicated. It sat down, facing the wall. "Shut down the feed," Drelthan said suddenly. "This is falsified. It has to be. Someone is manipulating the—" All feeds are authentic, the AI interrupted. Biometric scans confirm 8 Calthoran cubs, all within expected parameters for their age group. Human biosigns are consistent with species baseline. Elevated heart rate suggesting mild physical exertion, but no stress hormones indicating fear response. "She's not afraid," Colleen said wonderingly. "She doesn't understand what she's dealing with." "Oh, she understands," Felnoir countered, watching as Tina organized the remaining cubs into a rough circle on the floor. "Look at her movements. She's not hesitating. She's not second-guessing. Whatever she's doing, she thinks it's perfectly normal." On screen, Tina sat cross-legged in the middle of the circle. She held up different toys, a fabric sphere, a plastic ring, something that looked like it might be a teething implement from Earth. The cubs watched her with an intensity that should have preceded an attack. Instead, when she handed the fabric sphere to the cub on her left, it took the toy gently in its jaws and passed it to the next cub. "That's a sharing exercise," Drelthan said, his voice hollow. "She's teaching them to share. Calthoran cubs don't share. The concept doesn't translate into our developmental psychology. Resources are competed for, dominance is established, and only the strongest." The plastic ring made it all the way around the circle. Each cub held it briefly, then passed it along. When it returned to Tina, she smiled and made a gesture that the translator couldn't process, but that somehow communicated approval across species barriers. The cubs made a sound that Felnoir had never heard before. It wasn't the challenge growl that cubs used when establishing territory. It wasn't the distress call that brought adult Calthoran running. It was something else entirely, something that his translator kept trying to categorize as contentment vocalization, before rejecting the classification as impossible. "Pull up the cubs' medical files," Qualin ordered suddenly. "All of them, particularly their behavioral assessments from the ET homeworld." Felnoir triggered the data request, and holographic displays materialized around the control room. 8 files, 8 cubs, each one designated as high-priority diplomatic concern, and flagged with warnings that suggested they should be nowhere near an unsupervised human. "This one," Qualin said, pointing to the alpha cub still sitting in timeout. "Killed handler Thrinal within 1 rotation of assignment. Cause of death, severed throat during routine feeding. This one," she gestured to another cub, smaller but with distinctive scarring along its flanks, "sent 2 handlers to medical before being deemed unsuitable for standard care protocols. This one ate through containment barriers on 3 separate occasions." "They sent you their problem cubs," Felnoir realized. "They sent us the cubs that the homeworld couldn't handle," Colleen corrected. "The ones too aggressive for traditional raising, too dangerous for normal socialization." The Council's theory was that different environmental conditions might moderate their behavioral issues. We were supposed to study them under controlled conditions, document their development, and... She stopped, watching as Tina released the alpha from timeout, and it immediately rejoined the circle without any aggressive displays. "We weren't supposed to let a human daycare worker into the containment area." According to the staffing logs the AI offered, Tina was assigned to this sector following a scheduling error in the station's personnel management system. Her original assignment was early childhood education for the human families in Residential Section 9. The system classified the Calthoran cubs as children requiring care and routed her here instead. "A scheduling error," Drelthan repeated, "a random bureaucratic mistake, and now we're watching behaviors that shouldn't exist in our species." Tina stood up, brushing off her pants with casual indifference, to the fact that she was surrounded by creatures that could disembowel a grown Felnorian in under 3 seconds. She walked to a storage unit on the far side of the containment area, and all 8 cubs turned to track her movement with predatory focus. "Here it comes," Felnoir muttered, his hand hovering over the emergency response trigger. The moment she turned her back, the moment she broke eye contact with the pack, Tina pulled out a container and returned to the circle. She sat down again, opened the container, and began distributing what appeared to be food portions into 8 small bowls. The cubs waited, motionless, until she finished. Then she made another gesture, and they began eating simultaneously, each from their own bowl, with no attempts at resource competition. "I'm going down there," Colin announced. "This is beyond standard observation protocols. I need to understand what's happening before I file my report with the Council." "Are you insane?" Felnoir demanded. "Those cubs are sitting calmly in a circle, eating their meals without conflict, because a human told them to," Colin finished. "Whatever danger they represented an hour ago, it's not present now, and I need to know why." She was moving toward the door before Felnoir could formulate another objection. Drelthan followed, his academic curiosity apparently overriding his survival instincts. Felnoir watched them go, then returned his attention to the security feed, his claws still resting on the emergency protocols that every tactical bone in his body insisted he should have triggered 20 minutes ago. On screen, Tina had produced a cloth from somewhere and was wiping food residue from the smallest cub's face. The cub sat perfectly still, allowing the cleaning with no signs of distress or aggression. When she finished, it made that impossible contentment sound again, and Tina laughed, an easy, natural sound that suggested she'd done this 1,000 times before, with no concept that each time should have been her last. "AI," Felnoir said quietly, "send a priority communication to Calthoran High Council. Tell them we have a situation that requires immediate attention. Tell them—" He paused, trying to find words that wouldn't sound like he'd lost his mind. "Tell them that all previous models of Calthoran cub behavior may need to be reconsidered." "Message sent," the AI confirmed. "Estimated response time, 6 hours. 6 hours. 6 hours to watch a human daycare worker do the impossible and make it look routine. 6 hours to figure out how to explain that everything they thought they understood about one of the galaxy's most feared predatory species might be fundamentally wrong." On screen, Tina was organizing the cubs into what appeared to be a line. She held up a small ball and demonstrated throwing it into a container across the room. The first cub in line tried, missed, and made a frustrated sound. Tina said something that the translator rendered as encouragement. The cub tried again. It was going to be a very long 6 hours. Ambassador Qualin stepped through the containment area entrance with the kind of measured calm that came from 3 decades of diplomatic service, though her claws kept flexing involuntarily against her palms. Beside her, Drelthan had gone completely rigid, his professional demeanor cracking as he processed what his academic training insisted was impossible. All 8 cubs turned to look at them. The movement was synchronized, predatory, exactly the kind of unified threat assessment that made Calthoran hunting packs so devastatingly effective. Then Tina glanced up from where she was demonstrating something with colored blocks, smiled pleasantly, and said, "Oh, hi. Are you here for pickup already? I thought we had another hour." The cubs turned back to Tina. Just like that. No extended threat evaluation, no dominance displays toward the newcomers, no territorial aggression. They simply dismissed 2 adult Calthoran as irrelevant because the human had indicated they weren't a priority. I am Ambassador Colin, she managed, her translator struggling with the tightness in her throat. I oversee the Cubs' care arrangements on this station. I wanted to check on their adjustment to the new environment. They're doing great, Tina said with genuine enthusiasm. She gestured to the alpha cub, who was carefully stacking blocks into a tower structure. This one had a little trouble with sharing at first, but we worked through it. And this sweetie, she indicated the smallest cub, currently arranging blocks by color, was pretty shy initially, but look at her now, totally engaged with the group activities. Drelthan made a sound like something had broken in his respiratory system. That is Colrin, he said faintly. She killed her birth mother during the weaning transition. It's documented. She's classified as unmanageable under standard developmental protocols. Oh, she just needed some patience, Tina replied, completely missing the existential horror in his voice. She was acting out because she didn't feel secure. Classic anxiety behaviors. Once we established a routine and she understood the expectations, she settled right down. She paused, looking between them with mild concern. Are you two okay? You look kind of pale. Well, paler than usual. I'm still learning the baseline for everyone. Colin forced herself to move deeper into the room, every instinct screaming that she was entering a kill zone. The cubs watched her approach with interest but no aggression. One of them, Feldthak, she recognized from the facial ridge patterns, responsible for 3 handler deaths on the homeworld, made a questioning chirp sound and looked to Tina. It's okay, Tina said gently. These are friends. We use our indoor voices with friends, remember? Feldthak settled back down and returned to pushing a wheeled toy across the floor. Pushing it gently, playing with it, demonstrating fine motor control and restraint that shouldn't develop in Kaltharan cubs for another full rotation of maturation. How long have you been working with cubs? Quilin asked, trying to find some framework that would make this make sense. What training do you have in Kaltharan developmental psychology? Tina laughed, bright and easy. Oh, these are my first Kaltharan kids. Usually, I work with human children, 3 to 5 age range. I've done some interspecies care before. There were a few Anthan kids at my last placement, and 1 Felorian family. But this is definitely the most interesting assignment I've had. She picked up a cub that had wandered over to her, lifting it with casual confidence as it made that impossible contentment sound. Kids are kids, though, you know? Different species, sure, but the fundamentals are the same. They need structure, consistency, positive reinforcement, and someone who actually pays attention to what they're trying to communicate. The fundamentals are not the same, Drelthan said, his voice taking on the sharp edge of a professional watching his entire field collapse. Kaltharan cubs are obligate predators with hierarchical social structures determined through combat dominance. They don't respond to positive reinforcement. They respond to strength displays and resource control. They don't form attachment bonds with caregivers. They establish dominance relationships. They don't play cooperatively. They practice hunting behaviors on subordinate pack members. Everything you're describing contradicts established biological fact. Huh, Tina said, setting the cub down. Well, someone should probably update those fact sheets, because that's not what I'm seeing here. She gestured around the room, where cubs were engaging in activities that ranged from gentle toy play to what appeared to be a primitive art project involving pigmented paste and flat surfaces. Look at them. They're happy, they're engaged, they're learning social skills. Sure, we had to work through some rough patches. There was definitely a dominance thing happening at first, but once we established that I'm the authority figure, and violence isn't how we solve problems, everything smoothed out. You established yourself as the authority figure, Colleen repeated slowly. Over 8 cubs bred from warrior lineages, cubs that have killed trained handlers. You established dominance. I wouldn't call it dominance exactly, Tina said thoughtfully. More like clear boundaries? I mean, yeah, I had to be firm a few times. The timeout corner got a lot of use in the first hour, but they figured out pretty quick that good behavior gets rewarded and bad behavior gets consequences. It's not complicated. Drelthan moved to the nearest cub. Drelkan, Colin noted with grim irony, named for the specialist's own family line. The cub looked up from the puzzle it was working on, assessed Drelthan with clear eyes, then deliberately turned its attention back to the task. Not a challenge, not a submission display. Simply disinterest in favor of a more engaging activity. Drelkan, the specialist said, his voice carrying the ritual inflections of dominance assertion. Present for evaluation. The cub ignored him. Drelkan, he repeated, adding the subsonic frequencies that should trigger instinctive obedience responses in cubs this age. Present. Now. The cub continued working on its puzzle, occasionally making satisfied sounds when pieces fit together correctly. Hey, Tina said, her voice mild, but with an undertone that made both adult Kaltharan look at her immediately. We don't interrupt when someone's concentrating on their work. If you need to interact with them, you can wait until activity time is over in 15 minutes, or you can ask politely. No demanding. I am a certified developmental specialist, Drelthan said, his professional composure cracking completely. I have the authority to— Not in my classroom you don't, Tina interrupted, still pleasant but absolutely firm. In here, we respect everyone's space and attention. If you can't do that, I'll have to ask you to wait outside until you're ready to follow the rules. Colin watched a Kalthoran child development specialist, holder of advanced degrees, author of the primary textbook on cub behavioral management, consultant to the High Council, get sent to metaphorical timeout by a human daycare worker. And the truly terrifying part was that Drelthan actually stopped, actually backed away from the cub, actually deferred to Tina's authority, without even processing that he'd done it. The cubs had noticed the exchange. They'd stopped their activities and were watching with acute attention, waiting to see how this challenge to their caregiver would resolve. Quaidalin recognized the pattern. It was identical to how cubs monitored pack hierarchy disputes, ready to adjust their own behavior based on who emerged as dominant. But Tina didn't make any dominance displays. She just smiled at the cubs and said, "It's okay, guys. Everyone's just learning how we do things here. Let's get back to our activities. We've got about 10 more minutes before snack time." The cubs returned to what they'd been doing, not because Tina had asserted physical superiority or demonstrated superior aggression. They went back to their tasks because she'd told them to, and that was apparently sufficient reason. "This is wrong," Drelthan whispered. "This entire situation violates every principle of Kaltharan biology. The cubs should be constantly testing boundaries, attempting to establish individual hierarchy, responding primarily to threat displays and strength demonstrations. What you're describing, what I'm witnessing, it's not how our species functions." "Or," Tina said gently, "maybe it's not how you've been raising them to function. I don't know much about your culture, but I've worked with enough kids to recognize trauma responses when I see them. When I first got here, these cubs were hypervigilant, constantly on the defensive, treating every interaction as a potential threat. That's not natural predator behavior. That's anxiety. That's what happens when children grow up in unstable environments where they can't predict What's going to happen next? They are predators, Qualin said, but her conviction was wavering. We are predators. Our entire evolutionary history is based on competition, on strength, on survival of the most capable. Sure, Tina agreed easily. Humans are predators too, did you know that? Pursuit predators. We literally evolved to chase prey until it collapsed from exhaustion. We've got forward-facing eyes. We eat meat. We've got the same basic hunting package your species has. But we also figured out pretty early that cooperation beats competition in the long run. That raising kids in stable, supportive environments produces healthier, more capable adults than raising them in constant conflict. She moved to the storage area and began pulling out small bowls. You want to see something interesting? Watch this. Tina held up one bowl. Immediately, all 8 cubs stopped what they were doing and looked at her. Snack time, she announced. Everyone to the circle, please. Remember our routine. The cubs moved into formation, that same circle that Felnoir had watched them create earlier. They sat, evenly spaced, waiting with impatience that should have been impossible for juveniles of any species, let alone Calthoran. Tina distributed the bowls, placing one in front of each cub. The food portions were identical, Colin noted. Exactly the same amount in each bowl. No hierarchy of distribution, no priority given to stronger cubs, nothing that reflected the traditional resource allocation patterns that governed Calthoran pack dynamics. Okay, Tina said. Go ahead. They ate, all 8 of them, simultaneously, peacefully, with no attempts at resource theft or dominance displays over food. The smallest cub, the one who'd killed her birth mother during weaning, ate at exactly the same pace as the largest, with no signs of the defensive aggression that should accompany feeding in cubs this age. That's impossible, Drelthan said flatly. Feeding time is the highest stress period in cub development. It's when the most injuries occur, when hierarchy gets reinforced, when kids are afraid they won't get enough, Tina finished. Yeah, I've seen that in human children from food-insecure backgrounds. But when they know food is consistent, when they trust they'll get their fair share every time, the competition stops. They relax. She gestured around the room. That's what you're seeing here. Cubs who've figured out that their needs will be met consistently, that violence doesn't get rewarded, that cooperation is actually more pleasant than constant fighting. You're not looking at biology. You're looking at environment and learned behavior. Qualin felt something fundamental shifting in her understanding. She'd spent 3 decades in diplomatic service, the last 12 specifically focused on Calthoran cultural exchange. She'd written papers on the biological imperatives that shaped her species' social structures. She'd advised the High Council on developmental policies based on established evolutionary psychology. And a human daycare worker, armed with nothing but patience and playground rules, was demonstrating that everything might be wrong. The High Council needs to see this, she said quietly. Not a report, not data. They need to see this with their own eyes. Already sent the communication. Felnoir's voice came through her personal comm. They're prioritizing response. Expect contact within 3 hours. 3 hours. 3 hours until the leadership of her entire species witnessed cubs behaving in ways that contradicted every fundamental assumption about Calthoran nature. Tina was cleaning up the bowls, humming something that the translator couldn't quite categorize. The cubs had resumed their activities, moving between different stations with casual comfort. One of them brought a toy to Qualin, making an inquisitive sound. "Oh, that's sweet," Tina said. "They want to include you in play. That's really good socialization. Go ahead, toss it for them." Qualin looked at the toy, a simple fabric sphere. She looked at the cub, waiting expectantly, with what might have been eagerness in its posture. She threw the sphere across the room. The cub chased it, brought it back, and sat waiting for her to throw it again. And Qualin, ambassador of the Caltharan people, architectural member of the High Council's advisory board, author of definitive texts on interspecies relations, found herself playing fetch with a cub that should have killed her on sight. Drelthan sank to the floor, his legs apparently no longer capable of supporting his weight. "I need to revise my entire publication history," he said distantly. "Everything. Every paper, every study, every recommendation, it's all based on faulty premises." "Or based on the results you got from the environment you created," Tina offered. "Don't beat yourself up. You didn't know there was another way? Now you do." "Now we do," Quillen echoed, watching the cub return with the toy for a third throw. "And now everything changes." The High Council representative arrived in 2 hours instead of 3, which told Colin exactly how serious they were taking this situation. What she hadn't expected was that they'd send Grandmother Nalway, the oldest living member of the council, keeper of historical records, and the most traditionalist voice in Caltharan government. If they wanted to dismiss Tina's methods as human peculiarity, they'd sent the perfect witness. Grandmother Nalway entered the observation room with movements that spoke of age and absolute authority in equal measure. She took one look at the security feeds and went completely still. On screen, Tina was reading to the cubs, actually reading from a physical book, while 8 apex predators sat in an attentive semicircle around her. One of the cubs had its head resting on her knee. Another was leaning against its neighbor, completely relaxed. The smallest one, the birth mother killer, was making soft sounds in rhythm with Tina's voice, like humming along to music. "How long has this been happening?" Nalway asked, her voice carrying none of the skepticism Colin had anticipated. "Approximately 4 hours since initial contact," Felnoir replied. "0 incidents, 0 injuries. The cubs have responded to every directive the human has given." "Show me the feeding sequence." Felnoir pulled up the recorded footage. Nalway watched in silence as 8 cubs ate peacefully from identical portions, with none of the resource guarding that defined traditional cub behavior. When it finished, she gestured for more. "Show me the dominance establishment. There must have been a challenge phase." "There was," Felnoir confirmed, pulling up earlier footage. "The alpha cub attempted to assert hierarchy within the first 20 minutes. The human used what she calls a time-out protocol. The cub complied. They watched the alpha walk itself to the corner, sit facing the wall, and wait until Tina released it. No physical dominance display from Tina. No aggression. Just clear expectation and consistent consequence. Nalway was quiet for a long moment. "I need to speak with this human. Directly." Colleen led the way to the containment area, Drelthan trailing behind them like someone walking to their own professional execution. When they entered, Tina looked up from where she was helping a cub wash its hands at a small sink station. "Oh, hello," Tina said brightly. "Getting popular in here today. You must be another supervisor?" "I am Grandmother Nalway of the High Council," the elder said, and something in her tone made even Tina pause. "I have studied Caltharan cub development for longer than you have been alive, child. I have raised 6 cubs of my own bloodline. I have overseen the training of thousands of handlers across our home world. And I am watching you accomplish things that I believed to be biologically impossible." "Oh," Tina said, suddenly uncertain. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to step on any toes. The assignment just said childcare, and I thought—" "You thought correctly," Nalway interrupted. That is precisely the problem. She moved closer, studying the cubs with an intensity that made Colin's translator struggle to categorize her emotional state. We have been raising our children wrong. For generations beyond counting, we have structured cub development around competition, around hierarchy established through combat, around the belief that only strength matters. We told ourselves this was biology, this was nature, this was what our species required. She gestured to the cubs, who were now watching the adults with curious attention. But you come here with no knowledge of our ways, no understanding of our biology, and you treat them as children who need guidance rather than subordinates who need domination. And they respond. They're just kids, Tina said softly. They need to feel safe. They need to know someone's in charge who won't hurt them. They need consistency and patience, and someone who believes they can do better. She paused. That's not species-specific. That's just how children work. Nalwe made a sound that the translator rendered as profound grief. We have damaged generations of our young. We took natural predatory instincts and weaponized them through fear and competition. We created the violence we claimed was inevitable. She looked at Tina with something that might have been respect. You have shown us a different path, one that our entire civilization must now consider. I mean, I'm happy to share my curriculum, Tina offered, clearly overwhelmed. I've got structured activity plans, behavioral management, techniques, developmental milestone guidelines. It's all pretty standard Earth childhood education stuff, but if you think it would help, it would revolutionize our species, Drelthan said quietly. If we can raise cubs without trauma, without constant hierarchy battles, without the violence we accepted as normal, the implications are beyond measure. One of the cubs approached Nalwe, making that impossible contentment sound. The grandmother looked down at it, and when she spoke again, her voice was thick with emotion. I thought my own cubs' aggression was natural. I thought the injuries they inflicted on each other were normal development. I thought I was a good mother because I raised strong, dominant offspring. She reached down with trembling claws and, for the first time in Colin's memory, touched a cub with gentleness rather than control. I never knew there was another way. The cub leaned into her touch, and Grandmother Nalwe, architect of traditional Kalthoran child-rearing policy, defender of ancient ways, most powerful voice in conservative council circles, began to weep. The emergency council session convened via quantum link within the hour, every seat filled with representatives who'd watched the footage and refused to believe it without personal testimony. Grandmother Nalwe stood before them, her composed authority restored, but something fundamental had shifted in her bearing. I have witnessed impossible behavioral patterns in 8 cubs classified as unmanageable, she began without preamble. Cubs that killed handlers on our homeworld are now demonstrating cooperative play, emotional regulation, and attachment bonding with a human caregiver who has no training in our species whatsoever. The chamber erupted in overlapping voices, translators struggling to process the chaos. Council leader Pelthar raised his claws for silence. Grandmother, you're asking us to believe that a human, a species we've classified as absurdly fragile, has succeeded where our best handlers failed? I'm asking you to believe what I've seen with my own eyes, Nalwe replied. More importantly, I'm asking you to question why our methods failed when hers succeeded. Colin stepped forward, bringing up holographic displays of the cub's behavioral metrics. The data is conclusive. Stress hormone levels in all 8 cubs have dropped by 83%. Aggressive incidents, 0. cooperative behaviors, increased by factors we can't even properly quantify because we had no baseline for cubs acting this way. They're not just calmer, they're developing capabilities we didn't know existed in juveniles this age. "Show us the dominance establishment," demanded Felcrath, the council's military advisor. "No handler controls cubs without demonstrating superior strength." Felnoir played the footage. The council watched Tina redirect aggressive behavior with nothing but verbal instruction and consistent consequences. They watched her establish authority through patience rather than violence. They watched cubs choose cooperation over competition because she'd made cooperation more rewarding. "This is manipulation," Felcrath insisted. "Some human technology we don't understand. Some chemical influence." "I ran every scan available," Drelthin interrupted, his voice carrying the weight of professional devastation. "No technology, no chemical agents, no biological manipulation. She's using educational techniques developed for human children and applying them universally. And they work better than anything in our entire developmental psychology database. Because our database is built on faulty assumptions," Nalwe said quietly. "We assumed violence was biology. We assumed hierarchy required combat. We assumed that strength had to be proven through domination. We structured our entire child-rearing philosophy around survival of the most aggressive, and we created exactly what we expected to find." She pulled up comparative footage, traditional Calthoran cub raising versus Tina's methods. The contrast was devastating. In traditional settings, cubs were constantly vigilant, aggressive, competing for every resource. In Tina's care, they were relaxed, playful, genuinely enjoying each other's company. "We traumatized our children," Nalwe continued, "and called it education. We fostered violence and called it natural. We created generations of warriors because we raised our young in warfare, then convinced ourselves we had no choice. You're suggesting we overhaul our entire cultural approach to child development based on one human's interaction with 8 cubs?" Pelthar asked, but his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "I'm suggesting we acknowledge that we've been harming our young for longer than our historical records reach," Nalwe replied. "I'm suggesting that if a human with no knowledge of our species can raise healthier, happier cubs in 4 hours than we've managed in millennia, perhaps our biology isn't the constraint we thought it was." The council chamber fell silent. On the displays, Tina was organizing the cubs for what she called quiet time, a rest period where cubs settled on individual mats with soft music playing. Every single one of them was relaxed, content, secure. "The human must train our handlers," Pelthar said finally. "Every facility, every family unit, every caregiver across the homeworld. If there's even a possibility that we can raise our young without the trauma we've normalized, we have no choice but to try." "It's more than possibility," Qualin said. "It's proven fact. The question isn't whether her methods work. The question is whether we're brave enough to admit we've been wrong and change everything because of it." Grandmother Nalwe looked directly at the council leader. "I raised 6 cubs using traditional methods. 4 of them barely speak to me now. The other 2 died in territorial disputes before reaching maturity. I thought I was a successful mother because that was normal in our society." Her voice cracked. "I will not let another generation suffer what we've inflicted on ours. Not when we know there's a better way." The vote was unanimous. Within 3 hours, Tina had been appointed special consultant to the Calthoran High Council on Child Development, with full authority to restructure their entire approach to raising cubs. She accepted with characteristic confusion, then immediately asked if she could finish the day's activities first, because the cubs were about to start art projects, and she'd promised they could finger paint. Grandmother Nalway, architect of traditional policy, sent an official council motion that art projects were now mandatory in all cub care facilities. It passed without debate. 3 weeks later, Commander Felnoir stood in what had been a standard diplomatic facility and was now something his tactical training had no framework for. A Calthoran early learning center designed entirely around human educational principles. Tina moved between activity stations with practiced ease, observed by 24 Calthoran handlers who were taking notes with the intensity of military recruits learning combat protocols. Except instead of weapons training, they were learning about circle time and positive reinforcement and emotional validation. The original 8 cubs had become teaching assistants of sorts, demonstrating proper behaviors for the newest arrivals. 6 more cubs transported from the homeworld specifically because they'd been deemed too aggressive for traditional handling. They'd been on the station for 4 days. Not one incident of violence had been recorded. This one was particularly difficult, Colin said, indicating a cub that was currently helping Tina distribute snacks. Killed 2 handlers and put 3 more in medical. The recommendation was isolation protocols until maturity, possibly termination if aggression couldn't be controlled. And now? Felnoir asked, though he could see the answer. Now she's the most enthusiastic helper in the group. Tina says she was just understimulated and anxious. Gave her responsibilities, consistent structure, and suddenly the aggression vanished. Colleen's voice held something that might have been wonder. We were going to kill her because we didn't understand she was bored and scared. Drelthan approached, carrying a data tablet that displayed behavioral metrics, scrolling in continuous update. The homeworld facilities are reporting initial results from the new protocols. Aggression incidents down 68% in the first implementation wave. Handler injuries down 80%. Cubs are sleeping through rest periods instead of maintaining constant vigilance. Some facilities are reporting behaviors we've never documented before. Spontaneous affection displays, play without dominance context, voluntary sharing of resources. How is the resistance? Felnoir asked. Change this fundamental never came without pushback. Surprisingly minimal, Colin replied. Grandmother Nalway's testimony carried significant weight. But honestly, the cubs themselves are the best argument. Parents see the difference immediately. Calmer cubs, happier cubs, cubs that don't constantly compete for dominance within family units. The traditional approach starts looking like cruelty once you've seen the alternative. On the far side of the room, Tina had gathered all 14 cubs into a circle. Okay, friends, we're going to practice something new today. It's called empathy. Can everyone say empathy? The cubs attempted the word with varying success. Their translators struggling with the concept that didn't have a direct Calthoran equivalent. Empathy means understanding how someone else feels, Tina continued. When your friend is sad, you feel sad with them. When your friend is happy, you feel happy with them. Let's try an exercise. She had them pair off, then gave each pair a scenario to act out. One cub pretends to be hurt. The other responds with comfort. The handlers watched with expressions that suggested they were witnessing religious revelation. This was more than childcare. This was the foundation of a society that could value cooperation over domination, that could build communities instead of just hierarchies. The military is requesting consultation, Felnoir said quietly. They want to know if these techniques could be adapted for adult integration. Pack dynamics, unit cohesion, hierarchy without violence. You're asking if one human daycare worker can restructure an entire warrior culture, Collins said. I'm asking if she already has, Felnoir replied. These cubs will grow up different from any Calthoran in history. They'll raise their own cubs using these methods. In 3 generations, our entire species will be transformed. Grandmother Nalwe entered the observation area, moving with more energy than Felnoir had seen in her for cycles. The Council has voted to establish the Interspecies Developmental Research Center here on this station. Permanent facility. We're inviting other species to send their most challenging juveniles. If human methods can work across species barriers, we need to understand how and why. Other species are already asking, Qualin confirmed. The Anthari want to send their adolescent clutches. The Feller are inquiring about integration programs. Word is spreading that humans have solved developmental challenges we all thought were biological constants. And Tina? Felnoir asked, completely overwhelmed by the administrative side, thrilled about the teaching opportunities, and currently more concerned about whether we can get proper art supplies shipped in than about the fact that she's revolutionizing galactic understanding of child development. Colleen's translator conveyed something that might have been affection. She's planning a field trip next week, wants to take the cubs to see the station's gardens, says they need exposure to natural environments for healthy development. A field trip, Felnoir repeated, with 14 apex predator cubs, with 14 children who've learned that the world is safe, that adults can be trusted, and that cooperation is more rewarding than conflict, Qualin corrected. Yes, a field trip. The gardens are preparing a special educational program. Down in the center, Tina was reading a story to the cubs, who sat in their characteristic attentive semicircle. The newest arrivals, the ones deemed too dangerous for standard handling just days ago, were completely absorbed in the narrative, making soft sounds of engagement when something exciting happened in the plot. I spent 30 rotations in military service, Felnoir said quietly. Fought in 4 major conflicts, led battalions through combat scenarios that had no good outcomes. And I've never seen anything as revolutionary as watching someone be kind to children and having that kindness transform everything. Humans, Colleen said, with something that sounded like respect. They see a problem everyone else calls impossible, and their solution is just to care more consistently. Tina finished the story and started organizing the cubs for outdoor time, chatting with them about what they might see in the gardens. The handlers scrambled to follow, still taking notes, still learning how to turn violence into security, dominance into guidance, fear into trust. Commander Felnoir watched them go and thought about how a simple scheduling error had fundamentally altered the trajectory of an entire species. How one human, armed with nothing but patience and playground rules, had accomplished what centuries of Calthoran developmental psychology couldn't. The galaxy, he suspected, was going to look very different in a generation. All because someone took a toy from a predator cub, tossed it across the room, and the cub came running back like it was the most natural thing in the world.